in the Middle East, or the GCC specifically, there's a bigger affinity to understanding Bitcoin. It just needs the right type of education. It is a commodity region, heavily based in commodity, whether it is oil, whether it is gold or jewelry, throughout history. And it just makes sense to them.
Hey there. I'd love to get your input on something. I'm exploring the idea of creating an online community for Bitcoiners who see Bitcoin as more than just an investment or a savings technology. Those who understand that it's a change agent for growth, both personally and for our societies. So, in this early research phase, I'd love to hear from you. If you could take 5 minutes and go to bitcoinformillennials.com/survey and let me know what you think about what you would like to see in a community like that, then you can help me create a place that fosters personal growth, long-term thinking, connection, and education. So please, if you want to help, go to bitcoinformillennials.com/survey and let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much. Now let's dive into this episode. All right, Ralph Gebran, welcome to Bitcoin for Millennials.
Hey, Bram, thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, man. I'm happy you're here. Let's talk about the MENA region. I think people are very interested in this part of the world when we also, in general, but of course also when we talk about Bitcoin. You are stationed in that region. And let's chat about how Bitcoin is developing over there. And I'd love for you to share your insights and all the things you've learned spending on Bitcoin and talking to people about Bitcoin over there. We'll definitely get to that because you work at Onramp MENA, and over there, you offer advisory, educational services to high net worth individuals, family offices, etc. How has the reaction been so far to the presentations and the conversations that you've had over the past time?
Yeah, so the MENA region, well, the GCC in particular, because the MENA covers North Africa. So I think our conversation today will focus more on the GCC. That's our top priority for now. It's quite fascinating. You come to Dubai, that's where I'm based. And, Dubai has been one of the most crypto-friendly countries. Well, the UAE has been the most crypto-friendly country, and it's always on the news, right? Now, it's funny because typically the things happen in the West and then they follow their way through to the Middle East a few years later. But this time around, the GCC nations in general decided to take a different approach. When crypto, not just Bitcoin, came into the forefront of mainstream media, they decided, you know what, this is our opportunity. Let's get a head start. And so they developed these regulatory framework to incentivize individuals and corporations to come set up shop here. So it's quite fascinating that you can talk to regulators and they understand what you're talking about. So the level of sophistication from a technical point of view, so it's quite rare to talk to someone here within the space and in the regulatory landscape and they don't understand what hash rate is or what a blockchain does or how that works. Most people here are extremely crypto friendly. They've developed an understanding about, the asset class. Sadly, though, that comes with consequences. So there's this commingling of Bitcoin with everything else. So here, Bitcoin is less viewed as a commodity and is actually regulated as a digital asset, which is quite fascinating. And the problem with that is when you regulate it like digital assets, the first thing that comes to mind to people here is, there's no utility for Bitcoin because everyone can build their own blockchain project and try to solve all the problems in the world, like real world asset tokenization. But that's why we're here. And we're noticing, similar to what I said earlier, that things happen in the West and then they make their way here. And since we've been here for almost 10 months now, but the regulatory framework has already been in place for like 3 to 4 years now, I'm starting to see people understand Bitcoin more and better understand its value proposition. And I think what's happening in the West right now, especially in the United States with talks about a Bitcoin strategic reserve, the ETFs had a huge impact. So for some of the more sophisticated traditional finance folks, that's a really easy segue into the asset class without all the sophistication of, self-custody or other forms of custody, managing the asset or holding it. So it's a weird place, man. I mean, there's so much crypto stuff here, but it also makes the conversation a bit easier because you don't have to explain the technicalities and the complexities. So we can focus more on the monetary properties of Bitcoin because they understand how it works. But you need to explain the, Austrian economics point of view, the store of value point of view, and how it fits in someone's portfolio. And that's where, you do half the work basically, because a lot of people usually struggle with understanding how Bitcoin works, how it maintains its 21 million cap. But here is very different. Here we try to focus on, yeah, you know how it works, but I'm going to tell you why how it works is so important and why just being how it is enough for Bitcoin, especially in a world where we see constant monetary expansion and, monetary inflation destroying people's purchasing power. I mean, life here is getting expensive as well. It's not a Western thing only. Rents in Dubai, for example, have skyrocketed since I got here like 10 months ago. And before that, prices of my friends, who were locked in for the year were like, 25% cheaper. Like that's quite the inflation on property prices. But yeah, I mean, you talk to a lot of interesting folks. There's a lot of people trying to sell you stuff, crypto stuff. And there's a lot of, one of the more trendy things right now is tokenizing everything. Starting with, real estate. I've heard people talk about tokenizing cargo planes, because you can get a yield on renting a cargo plane. Yeah. But it's funny because you'll see a lot of that. Web3 is a common word here, blockchain and all that stuff. But I think unlike in the West, where it's the Wild West when it comes to these projects, here there's a lot of regulation to protect the consumer, which is a good thing. So things don't blow up. Well, they don't blow up as fast as they do in the US. Like pump and dump schemes at the local level are extremely rare because there is actually a digital asset regulator. So a virtual asset regulator here is what they call them, VARA. And they make sure everyone is in line to protect the consumers. That's the top priority here. But yeah, I'll stop there if you have any questions about, the fascinating landscape here. And I mean, the UAE isn't the only one. Before I turn it back to you, but I actually went to Bahrain a few months ago. And it's a funny story, actually. As Bitcoiners, we never imagine setting foot in a central bank. Well, 3 months ago, I had a meeting with the Central Bank of Bahrain, and I actually presented our solution, the Onramp multi-institution custody solution, and they understood it right off the bat. We didn't have to try that hard. What's beautiful about Bahrain is they have one single regulator, unlike the UAE. So I'll get to that in a second just to give you a little bit of insight. So in Bahrain, the sole regulator is the Central Bank of Bahrain. And they are insanely forward thinking. If you just go through their website and you look at the regulation around digital asset, it's fascinating how far along they are. The UAE is a bit different. So the UAE, for your audience who doesn't know, is divided into a variety of emirates. So think of them as like states in the United States under one country. And within those emirates, there are things that they call free zones. And those free zones are kind of like small cities within the Emirates, and they have their own set of regulations. So you have mainland regulation, but you also have free zone regulators. The reason why they created these is to incentivize foreign companies to come and set up shop, and the regulation in those free zones are Commonwealth. So very similar to Western regulation with a few tweaks here and there. So it's extremely easy to enter the market here from a regulatory point of view. I mean, you just go to their website, you follow the steps, you get in touch with someone, and they help you set up a company. So that's why we're seeing huge companies and brand names within the space setting up headquarters within the region. So especially in the UAE and Bahrain. Now, of course, the UAE market is much bigger than the Bahrain market. But I mean, you have your selection to facilitate your market entry, which is a great thing. So comparing it to the West, I would say on a scale from 0 to 10 in terms of friendliness, I would give it a 9, 10 for people to enter the space and start companies within the region. Sadly, there's not a lot of Bitcoin companies. I think we're one of the only ones, actually potentially the only pure Bitcoin company in the UAE.
Bitcoin custody is evolving, and while self-custody is important, it has its own risks and trade-offs. Onramp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your custody setup. Onramp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-signature vault, guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, Onramp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Check out onrampbitcoin.com through the link below and schedule a consultation with the Onramp team to get to know them and learn more about their offering.
Interesting, man. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Of course, when you are on Bitcoin Twitter, it's a lot of stuff is focused on America, of course. So I love your perspective. Yeah, you mentioned GCC, that's Gulf Cooperation Council, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, yeah, UAE, and then Saudi.
Yes.
Yeah. So why do you think, like in these countries, or at least the places that you've been in and where you're at, why is there such good regulation? Like, what makes it that they are so forward-looking and like embracing this new development? Although they say Bitcoin is now just like everything else, that's fine, of course. But like, where does that come from? I mean, if you look in the West, I mean, in America, it is changing in a sense. Mm-hmm. I personally think, Bitcoin embodies real pure like OG American values, let's say, which is of course already different in Europe. I think in Europe is just asleep behind the wheel. UK is even worse in terms of Bitcoin. But yeah, the countries in these regions really embrace it. Like how, yeah, where does that come from, you think?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons why. One, if you look 10, 15, 20 years in the past, and you looked at the GCC, the first thing that comes to mind is oil. So they built everything because of their oil industry. Now, eventually, oil is going to run out at some point. At least that's what some people say. And what they're trying to do, and it's not just the UAE, but it's, the vast majority of the GCC countries, it diversify their economies away from just being an oil country. So they're trying to diversify into fintech, digital assets, AI, and they've really created these accelerator programs and ease of getting licensed for technology companies, because here regulations divided into 2 sections. So either you're a financial activity, so you're doing financial stuff, that's extremely regulated to protect the consumer. But if you're a non-financial entity, that's considered a unregulated activity. So you have so much more leeway and subsidies to facilitate your entry into the market. I think there was the Dubai Expo, and now in Saudi, there's going to be the 2030 Saudi Expo. So what they're doing is they're incentivizing expats to come and build here and build the economies of tomorrow. And I think it's a smart move. For example, in the UAE, Dubai is kind of the service hub and touristic location. So they've extremely diversified the country. That's why you see all these crazy buildings, these crazy initiatives that they're doing. People want to come here and check it out for themselves. No taxes. I mean, that's huge for someone who wants a different type of lifestyle and to keep more of their purchasing power. It's really friendly. It's extremely safe. So they're making sure they put these pieces together to diversify their economy by bringing in people who may have expertise in certain areas that they don't yet. They also absorb that into their economy, and then they become expert at it as well, the same way they've mastered the oil industry, right? So they started off, for example, with Western companies. But now, for example, in Saudi Arabia, Aramco is the biggest oil giant and potentially, I think, the biggest in the world in terms of the oil industry itself. And it's a national treasure. But I think oil gas. They're also looking to think sustainably as well. So what they're trying to do is move away from that industry. And I think as well, Bitcoin mining is a part of that because there's a lot of rumors about GCC countries leveraging their excess energy and cheap energy and excess solar irradiance because, it almost never rains here. And when it does rain, you know about it because it's a major problem. That's how rare rain is. So I think it just makes sense for them to diversify away because they want to be more green. They want to try to change their reliance from oil. And I think they took on the tech route. And don't forget, the Middle East is literally a bridge between the West and the East. So you have a huge expat community, for example, from India, who are really big in the STEM fields. So science, engineering, computer science and computer engineering. And a lot of them come here because they get paid higher salaries. They get to keep more of that salary because the regulation is facilitating their entry. So people have big ideas, especially in a nascent industry like, Bitcoin, digital assets, whatever it may be, fintech, you're incentivized to come here because it's much cheaper from a administrative and regulatory point of view. So I think those are the main reasons why we see them diversifying away from oil and why fintech and the digital asset space is just booming here.
It's so fascinating that, I almost want to say the European mind cannot comprehend, but like...
Hey, the European mind is good at one thing in particular, and I think you would agree with me, and that's regulation, but not the good kind of regulation, over-regulation, where you kill the entrepreneur before he even gets started.
Well, I think it's good you say that because you are sharing like, okay, there is regulation, but that is because they want to be clear and inviting, right?
Yes.
And they want to be clear and inviting because they're thinking about, okay, how do we keep this going? I have to think about, when Michael Saylor says, if you want to give the grandchildren of your grandchildren your wealth of your your capital, there's only one way that you can do that, and that is Bitcoin, right? And that is, of course, a big thing to say and something I think many people don't think about just in general. But when you are a country, you want to think about, like, this is my situation right now in UAE, for example. It's really good, right? Like lots of money, lots of energy, etc. It's very safe and all these things. But yeah, how do we keep that going? And what are all the things that we have to keep in mind that could happen? Like, let's say the oil runs out. I never heard about that, but let's go with it, right? Like just all the things, like how can we still be prosperous in 100+ years, right? Or how does this this of these little Emirates, how does that prosper for 1,000 years or stuff like that? Just the long-term thinking. And I love how you explain the regulation being built to be clear and inviting, so you know what you're coming to do, and or what you can do basically when you come over. And in Europe, I feel it's more protectionist in some way than they are actually communicating. And I think it's like under the false premise of, we have it so good that we need to keep it like that, and in order to do that, we have to set up boundaries. It's just a different way of looking at it. Like, I also think they do it because they are doing well, but they want to keep doing well with what they have. They don't think about, what does this look like in 50 or 100 years from now, And I think like that's the difference.
And also, one of the more fascinating things is you can talk to regulators here. They're not like hidden or you need to go through a million intermediaries. So if you have a good idea, an innovative idea, it's quite easy to find someone within the regulatory space and connect with them, even through basic connections on LinkedIn, and they'll be responsive. So they're always looking for something new, something that they can add to their ecosystem. And if it's a good idea and the regulatory framework doesn't provide guidance on it, they are more than likely willing to work with you to figure out how to place it within those boundaries, or maybe amend or create an exception. One thing that's fascinating, there's these tech startup licenses and innovation licenses. Basically, they create a sandbox environment for you for like a year, 2 years, where if it's a new and innovative idea or tech, whether in Bitcoin or anything else, AI, you can start functioning and start actually producing value with the regulators' oversight. And if they like the idea, they see that there is demand for it, it's safe, consumers are being protected, you are being a good citizen, following the law, following their guidance, then they will implement it and either change the regulation or just slide you in where appropriate. And that's fascinating. I have to say, usually, how easy is it to talk to an actual regulator in the West? It's literally impossible. There's like 20, 30.
They don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, they don't want to. You know,
That's the feeling I would.
And the problem is when you can't talk to the regulator directly, you are going to get most likely a no before you even get started, because the people that you are talking to are not willing to put their neck on the line for something that they don't understand.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that's what the incentive is. If you are working from protectionism,
Yes.
right, then you are like, oh no, this is scary, this is something. But I think it's good what you said about value, right? Like it's, hey, I want to come to your country or your region and I want to deliver value, I want to bring value, I want to create value. And I want to do that. And although this is a new idea, I still want to do it here. You know, like that's, I don't know, like that's already an invitation to some degree, right? To work with someone. And so, I don't know what you just shared. I think like, yeah, this is very logical. Like anyone would want that, but you know, there's a big difference between the West and this region here.
Yeah, and you know, you see a lot of negative sometimes connotation about the Middle East because, you know, people will say there's no freedom. But really, for an entrepreneur, in a lot of ways, there's more freedom to operate within the region here because, you know, your ideas have a chance of actually become reality because the regulator is on your side and the incentives are aligned. Because if they are, you know, willing to work with you and your idea is actually extremely successful and has huge value, then they would get the credit for that, right? And it's the idea, where did it happen? It happened here, not in the West. So we beat the West at something. Basically,
makes so much sense.
Yeah,
right? Like we made that happen. That's very interesting.
Exactly.
So about these GCC countries, like what are your thoughts on Bitcoin and energy there? You just mentioned it, but I mean, it makes so much sense for me when you sell like earth energy for digital energy, you know,
yeah.
For the people that go along with that analogy, by the way, because not everyone likes the digital energy thing, but yeah, it makes total sense for me. And especially because it cannot be debased, it's trustless, global, etc. The whole petrodollar thing is crumbling a little bit, not necessarily fully ended, I would say, but it makes a lot of sense to sell energy, which is a limited resource, for another limited asset instead of something that can be created infinitely, right? Like that makes a lot of sense. How do you, what are your thoughts on that? But also to go back to what you mentioned, you know, the energy generation combined with Bitcoin mining. I think this week there was also this paper, I don't know about which region that was, but that again showed how Bitcoin mining can help create a higher ROI for sustainable energy resources. So, I mean, that in general, I think is a narrative that's constantly evolving. But yeah, what are your thoughts on there, and what have you seen?
Yeah, so that's a topic where it's packed with a lot of rumors and speculation, and we hear about it all the time, especially after the Bitcoin MENA conference that happened a few weeks ago. Everyone, I think, deep down was hoping some major announcement that, you know, the UAE was mining tons of Bitcoin and, you know, they were quietly stacking. Now, I've spoken to a few people within the energy infrastructure, and every time I speak to them, no one can tell me, yeah, 100% it's happening. I don't know, because maybe they just can't give you a guarantee, but some will hint at, if you walk around, for example, Abu Dhabi, and you know what you're looking for, you'll actually see mining containers across the city. So there's a huge ecosystem here. There's
In the city?
yes, in the city.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and what's fascinating also, there are these, I don't know if they're legal or not, maybe not, but this people telling me about this, because I speak to a lot of people almost every day, right? And I try to build this puzzle about Bitcoin within the region. And here, farming is heavily subsidized because it's a desert. So farmers get huge amounts of subsidies and they have basically free energy because they want the farms to run and they want to become independent from importing food and vegetables and all that stuff. So the farmers and the miners, based on some of the conversation I've had, have been kind of building these partnerships where miners come in and use the farmer subsidized energy to mine Bitcoin. And it's not just one person who's told me that. There's a few, and they told me that's literally a ecosystem of itself.
That's interesting because I heard the same in China.
Yes. So, can I confirm it? I haven't seen them because these would be in remote areas far from urban cities. Quite a few people have told me that's happening. On top of that, you have big groups like the Phoenix Group, which is pretty much, I think, backed or partially owned by the Sovereign Wealth Fund in the UAE. That is a Bitcoin mining, basically, entity within the UAE, which does tons of mining. You have big players like Bitmain and Mara that are in the region as well. No one will tell you 100% who is the one doing the mining, but there is a lot of mining happening. And it just makes sense because there's so much excess energy and cheap energy. And there are plans, for example, to build solar farms in the middle of the desert that's free electricity basically. And to subsidize those projects, it just makes sense that you would use Bitcoin miners in those regions. Now, keep in mind that the miners themselves here take quite a bit of beating because it's a desert. There's tons of dust and it's extremely, extremely hot, especially in the summer month. So it's not an ideal place from a, infrastructure equipment point of view, but it's an ideal place because what you need to mine is so abundant and cheap. It's just energy and sun. So at some point, I speculate, don't keep me to this, but at some point, and I think, probably when the United States actually makes a firm commitment or some huge announcement about Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin reserve, I think some of the GCC countries, and my biggest bet would be on the UAE, they'd come out and potentially say something like, aha, we beat you to it as well. We're ahead of the game.
Well, I mean, I think that's already, I can Google it quickly, but I think there's already, I think it was 2023, there was already a Bitcoin mining operation from Marathon,
Yes.
I think,
Yeah.
that started in Oman with about almost like $1 billion investment.
Yes.
I think. Oman aims to capture 7% of the global Bitcoin hash rate by June 2025.
Yeah. And Oman
Wow.
is going heavy on Bitcoin mining, but from a Bitcoin adoption point of view, it's not there because they don't really have a regulatory framework for it. And same for Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, Saudi Arabia is really building heavily in the fintech space. So they are in competition with other GCC countries like UAE and Qatar, the more developed ones, right, and Kuwait. But from a religious point of view, it's harder there because Saudi Arabia is kind of the central location for Islam, right? It's the Holy Land. And in that specific culture, scholars have to chime in and give a kind of ruling on whether Bitcoin is okay or not to consume. Now, if you've heard one of the advisors of Onramp MENA, Harris Irfan, talk about Bitcoin, he would say Bitcoin is halal because of the way it functions, etc. So I think in Saudi Arabia, it's more sensitive because there's a religious component to saying, yeah, let's just go mine Bitcoin, or yeah, let's just, hold Bitcoin, because in a lot of FUD, Bitcoin is volatile. So it doesn't align culturally with some of the religious scholars, right? But, we've debunked that time and time again. Bitcoin's volatility is actually more good volatility than bad volatility, which means it's an asymmetric bet. And it has proven over the years that it is a store of value and it is transparent and basically it's ethical, which is what Islamic finance is all about. It's ethical finance. So
Yeah.
If you have your Bitcoin in self-custody, where are you keeping your Bitcoin seed words? For me, there's only one way, and it's backing up my seed phrase with stamp seed. It's a single durable plate without any parts or materials. Stamp your words into solid titanium, which is fire-resistant, water-resistant, and built to last. Unlike etching or engraving, stamp seed's patented tools help you to deeply stamp every letter for permanent readability, making it easy for you to protect your generational wealth. Don't risk losing your seed phrase on paper. Get a stamp seed plate for unmatched protection. You can use code BRAM, that's BRAM, for 15% off at stampseed.com.
I think it's interesting when volatility comes up. People use that in the wrong way, I would say, right? So they say volatility, the price goes up and down, etc. But I don't think that's the volatility that they should think about. They should think about, when you look at the euro, was €1 in 1999 or at the start. Now it's like 30 or 40 cents.
Yeah.
That is a volatile thing, but it's going down.
Look at the Canadian dollar. It's at 144 right now. It used to be a parity with the dollar.
Exactly, yeah. And so one Bitcoin will always be one Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I think you should think about it like that, right? In that sense, it is static. It's not volatile, right? It does not devalue. It doesn't debase, basically. You cannot make more of it. So it's actually the ultimate stable, predictable asset in the world. You know exactly how many there are at this moment, how many will be issued, etc. And so I always find it interesting when people talk about volatility, because volatility in price, or rather, I rather say exchange rate,
yes,
right, between different monies, that goes up and down. And I think that is based on understanding. If you really understand Bitcoin, you are not gambling with it, you are not trading with it. Maybe you're trading to gather more, but still,
you end up with less.
You'll probably lose the Bitcoin. Yeah, exactly, right? So, I find it really interesting when that is their argument. That was also in, I think it was Japan 2 weeks ago, where they said we're not going to adopt Bitcoin as a strategic asset because of volatility. Which I think is just fascinating. I really think it's the wrong way to...
just look at the yen this year. It's like a hypocritical statement. The yen has been extremely volatile, and it's hanging on the words of a few people at the Japanese central bank, right? So everyone's trying to guess, are they going to increase rates, lower rates, keep it neutral? And there's a lot of uncertainty there. But one thing to add about, the connection between Bitcoin and the Middle East, and I think, how Bitcoin clicked with you. Like there's that moment where you put in the work and then it's like, oh my God, this makes a ton of sense to me and I'm going to look into it. So I would think in the Middle East, or the GCC specifically, there's a bigger affinity to understanding Bitcoin. It just needs the right type of education because it is a commodity region, heavily based in commodity, whether it is oil, whether it is gold or jewelry. Throughout history, gold and oil have been synonymous with the GCC countries. And it just makes sense to them. Even from a religious point of view, even in Lebanon, where I'm from, for example, I used to hear, we gift people gold all the time, not random jewelry. For anything, we give gold. You had a baby, here's some gold for your baby. You bought a house, here's gold. It's your birthday, here's gold. And the other one is real estate as well. But I think oil and gold, once you understand the value in that, and you've understood it for millennia, it just takes a little bit of time. But I think the click moment will happen, especially there's a lot of countries, for example, Lebanon is going through hyperinflation right now. The problem is you would think everyone would be on Bitcoin, and the banks actually confiscated everyone's wealth overnight. Like you woke up, it's like you can't withdraw your money outside anymore. You have to
There's
go.
people that rob banks in Lebanon to get their own money.
Exactly. And you would think people would have been more into Bitcoin. But the problem is, and Saifuddin once spoke about it, is that they have too much of a high time preference because they can't think, they don't have enough time to ponder and to think and understand Bitcoin. They're thinking about, I need to be able to buy my groceries as soon as possible because in a week, the prices are going to change.
Yes.
And in those situations, even though Bitcoin's volatility most of the time is good volatility, you can't afford to be in that moment where its volatility is not beneficial to you.
It's actually really interesting, right? Because, and of course, this is hard, but if you have some excess money in like a hugely inflationary environment, it would actually help you if you would save, because then really the week after, you would have increased your purchasing power, right? But I totally agree with you. Like it's really, it's something I learned as well. I always thought like people that really experience the problem of inflation would like flock to Bitcoin, but they don't. I think mainly because of what you said. Like if you're surviving, you don't have time and space to think about how am I going to save.
Yeah.
You know, like it just makes a lot of sense.
Whatever comes in goes out, basically. And requires time. Let's be pragmatic and realistic. I mean, we're not at the point where people just use Bitcoin without understanding what it is. There's still some time and effort required to understand it. And then you have to see whether there is disposable income to actually invest in it. And what a lot of people don't talk about is, you know, the UTXO problem. I mean, some people say just buy $5 a day or $2 a day and move it, whatever you can buy and move it to your cold storage. The problem is they don't tell you the second half of that statement, which is you still need to manage your UTXOs. And a lot of these underdeveloped countries suffering hyperinflation where they can only afford to buy tiny fractions of Bitcoin, who's to say that these folks, because they don't have a full understanding of it, aren't going to lose whatever they put into Bitcoin because they haven't been managing their UTXOs, for example.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to think about just Bitcoin is so simple and makes so much sense, but it's just hard to grasp, right? And people in different regions with different wealth or cultural backgrounds or problems, challenges, etc., like they all have their own individual challenges in order to see, I think, what we now see, but it took a long time. Right.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting what you said about the gold and the culture in the Middle East. Like, I think it's even harder when it's so, because I think the narrative of gold, I think Bitcoin is superior to gold in every characteristic except the narrative.
Yes.
Right? Like, so the gold narrative is 5,000 years old. Like that is massive. Okay.
Yes.
And I don't mean the narrative like, oh, it's used in jewelry and used in smartphones. Like, I think that's not an argument. Just the narrative of this thing has value. It has had value in time of the freaking pharaohs, you know, like that is just really strong. But when it's so culturally ingrained, as you mentioned, like all these occasions where people give, it becomes harder to actually accept that practically there is a better asset to do the exact same things. But yeah, you're not going to give Bitcoin to new parents or something, right? You're still going to give gold because it's so culturally ingrained. Yes. And I love that idea of how the concept of Bitcoin makes so much sense in these countries from the energy perspective that you mentioned. But then their challenge is like, okay, but this goes against my entire cultural narrative of the usage of gold, you know. So I just love that thought because it's not practically, it could make a lot of sense, but it's not easy to change your own narrative and therefore change a bigger one.
Yeah, and that's why education is so important. And that's why, you know, we speak to people all the time, we walk them through, you know, the intricacies, comparing Bitcoin to what they're used to, showcasing, like you said, how it's superior at every level. But, you know, it's just going to take some time. I started giving Bitcoin rather than gold. like sats when I have an occasion. I'm like, hey, this is my gift. You'll thank me in 5 years. But it takes a little bit of time. Yeah, it's a paradigm shift. It's not easy. And the other component I think that a lot of people struggle with is, okay, so how do I hold it? And, self custody is great. Everyone should try it. But at the end of the day, not everyone's going to do it properly. And we can't expect the majority of people to hold cryptographic material. And, that's what we're trying to do in the region as well. We're trying to solve this, but we're doing this from the top bottom approach. So we think getting institutions, sovereign wealth funds to hold Bitcoin the right way will lead to scaling to the masses as well, especially people who are not going to be comfortable managing cryptographic material. Because yes, realistically, everyone should have some stack of self-custody, the same way you might have a few ounces of gold at home, just in case the apocalypse happens. But the reality is, for large sums of wealth, especially in a day and age where more and more people are starting to know who Bitcoiners are, and not every Bitcoiner is a OPSEC expert. Most Bitcoiners, even if they're using multi-sig, I can tell you the average person puts all the keys in the same vault in the same house. It's just my perception and my understanding of it, just by being pragmatic, right? And the people I talk to here who understand it, I mean, that's the feeling I get. It's not easy. Not everyone has multiple houses. Not everyone has family around to spread out the cryptographic material, or not everyone just capable to do that, and we need to find better ways to scale Bitcoin.
Yeah, interesting. What would you say are the misconceptions of Bitcoin adoption in the Middle East? I mean, you just mentioned the halal part. I always say it's like it's ultra halal.
It is ultra halal.
It's the most honest, hardest money, most transparent money to ever exist. I would say it's the most ethical money to ever exist. So that, from what I know from Islamic finance, that really aligns with the principles that are embodied there. So yeah, and so again, maybe not only that halal part, but just in general, like, yeah, what do you think are the misconceptions about Bitcoin?
I think the biggest one, just because of the deepness of the, I hate to use this word, but crypto ecosystem within the region, a lot of people will quickly compare other tokens, other blockchain to Bitcoin's utility. And like, yeah, but it can't do this, it can't do that, and it can't, NFTs or whatever, Web3 tokenizing stuff, it's too slow. Something. So everyone like quickly compares what it can do in terms of utility, but they fail to see what it can do in terms of protecting your purchasing power. It's like the narrative hasn't hit hard enough yet that the most important utility anything could do is to protect your purchasing power. Like that is literally the most important useful function of any form of money or asset or whatever you want to do. Like anything you invest in, the idea is to protect your purchasing power and to grow it. And the problem is people get distracted with the technology, the innovation, the blockchain features. I think that is the biggest misconception in the region. And that is one of the things we work the hardest on, which is you need a hedge against, because what they failed, this is how I view it. Why Bitcoin? My view on why Bitcoin is because everything in the world, any asset class in some form of way, is tied to the fate of the US dollar because it is the reserve currency of the world. Even a house in Brazil is affected by US monetary policy, whether you like it or not, any alternative asset. So even these blockchain, crypto, whatever projects, in some form of way, they are affected by US monetary policy because the world runs on interest rate differentials, and that's what affects currency prices. So when the US changes interest rates, everything gets repriced everywhere in the world. And either countries adjust their interest rate, they keep it the same, or they lower it. And so it affects everything within that economy. So venture capital money that's going into these Web3 blockchain crypto project is also affected by the US dollar. So the way I position Bitcoin, why? Because it's outside of all of that. It is not tied to the dollar. It is unconstrained, unlinked, and uncorrelated to the US dollar, making it really the only standalone asset class that you can get your hands on, because even gold is manipulated because of its centralization problem. But Bitcoin, because of its digital nature, allows it to be free from that problem that gold has. And it allows you really to disconnect a portion of your wealth from the US dollar monetary system. And that's how I view it. And when you speak to a lot of investors, sophisticated people, and they understand that rationale, that is a much better narrative to them than saying, oh, it's decentralized, oh, it's censorship. Here, no one cares about censorship resistance, really. Very few people will say, oh, I want it because censorship. But they want it when they understand that, oh, so now I am independent from the US dollar dominance. That makes it valuable to me.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's also, I think it was BlackRock that said like Bitcoin is an asset class by itself.
Yeah.
Like it is the asset and the class. It's just one thing. And I love that explanation. And I think that is also what people need to realize, right? Like, why do we talk about the US dollar in America so much? It's because it's the best fiat money currency, but that's only because they've inserted themselves in a brilliant move, right? As the world reserve currency and the currency that all the energy is priced in, mainly the oil, right? But I love the example of, and we touched upon it earlier. Like, okay, so if you are an oil producing country and you sell a limited asset, in a sense, there's also people that say oil is unlimited, right? That's a different conversation, I think. But it's a limited asset. And then in reward, just same as like our personal energy and time, right? And then you get paid for that in something that can be created infinitely by another country. Like that's the craziest trade that you could make, right? But of course, with the petrodollar, there was something that was gained, right, by Saudi Arabia. The military part of that agreement. So there was something that they gained. But in essence, when the US creates more dollars and they have those dollars as the first entity, those dollars haven't been debased yet. So they can spend it on anything. And the moment they spend it, they are basically in circulation, right? And debased, because they also debase all the other units of the currency that are already in existence. So they're basically buying energy, like just raw earth materials, all these things at a discount, which goes into effect after they paid for these commodities, right? And I think just this little thing, a lot of people have no clue about. Right. And as a country, you would want to step away from that. Right. And there's even countries that have the US dollar as their main currency, which is even a wilder thing.
Yeah, and a lot of those countries, because their currency is a million times worse than the US dollar. So they're like, we'll just take US dollars and don't get debased at multiple levels, right? Now, also what's fascinating is, because you touched on this, so the geopolitical landscape is changing. No one is saying it's the end of the dollar, maybe not in our lifetime, but we can clearly see that there is some form of trend forming where other countries are diversifying away from the dollars. And you can see this globally. There's a reason why every central bank almost is accumulating more gold. And that is very true in the GCC. That is a big thing. And, China is also a huge gold buyer, UAE, Saudi Arabia. So there's also this, political chess match happening where the US is trying to maintain its allegiance and alliances in the region. But you also have huge players like Russia and China who are now in the region with a very strong foothold. This was unheard of 20, 30 years ago. But now it seems they're no longer afraid to step into this area and start, building relationships, providing funding, and just being here. And you start to question, like, maybe countries in the region are looking to hedge against the US dollar. And that's where the speculation of having a Bitcoin stack comes into play, because what is the best hedge against the US dollar? It's the only thing that's not linked to the US dollar. So it makes just complete sense, especially when they have, the energy part already kind of there for them. So Bitcoin and energy is quite the recipe for hedging against US dollar dominance.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned China, because I wanted to look up and I found something fascinating, by the way. But China issued $2 billion of US bonds in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And that was oversubscribed. Just quickly reading. Yeah, which it was just really quickly oversubscribed. But who facilitated that? Deutsche Bank. Crazy. Okay, so but that's happening. Like this was in November, back in November.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a huge threat to the US dollar, right? Like if China can issue dollar denominated bonds that are oversubscribed in Saudi Arabia, I mean, that's quite a thing. And we don't, again, from the Western point of view, we don't really hear a lot about that.
No.
Right? So you don't hear anything about this whole battle around the currencies, basically.
Yeah, and in general, in the Middle East, there's a lot of, subtle military influence from the major powers, right? At some point, some countries were also colonized, or the French were here, the British were here, the US has tons of embassies across the region because there's oil and they have to protect the oil in some form of way. But you've seen a huge push from China across Africa as well, a land that was mainly Western influence between the British and the French. But the landscape is really changing, but you really have to look for it, because Western media wouldn't show you what's actually happening on the ground. And, being in the region, I lived previously in Canada before, and it was really hard. I had to really go to special websites to read about local news and what's happening. It doesn't show up on my Twitter feed. But when you're in the region, you start to really see things on the ground, and you see, the moves each player is making in action. Look at the entire regions being overhauled, between what happened in Lebanon, recently what happened in Syria, the war that's in the region. You see a lot of moving parts, and no one can really say what's going to come out of it. And that's why the Trump election was so huge. And, we can speculate as much as we want, but at the end, all we can do is just wait and see how things are going to develop. But fascinating times. You should come visit.
I should. I have a place to stay now, so that's
sure.
That's great.
Anytime. Listen, it's fascinating. Whatever people say, if you come to the Middle East, Dubai, or even Lebanon when things are calm, you'll have a great time.
Yeah, I would love to come. So I'll keep you to that
for sure.
What are your thoughts about the growth potential of Bitcoin in the region? Like, do you think we'll see something this year, as you mentioned before? Let's say America announces the strategic Bitcoin reserve, which I would put at 60% ish.
Yeah,
I'm very positive about it. Do you think the countries are going to move in this region, or as you said, Qatar or Oman is going to be whatever, we already have a few 100,000. What are your thoughts there?
I think it was going to be a domino effect, because there's going to be sovereign game theory in play, and no one wants to show their cards until the big player shows theirs. So we can be surprised in any possible way. It could be the UAE, it could be Oman. We don't know which one has the biggest stack. I'm sure someone has a stack. I can't tell you who, but the likelihood of one or multiple GCC countries actually mining and safekeeping that stack is increasing by the day, especially since the Trump hint of the Bitcoin strategic reserve. I think growth-wise, the region is primed for Bitcoin adoption. And I think because of the cultural understanding and the commodity-based nature of the culture, it just makes sense. And I think we'll see a major shift over the next few years in terms of turning to Bitcoin only versus this whole crypto ecosystem. And I think the traditional asset allocators, like the sovereign wealth funds, big asset management firms within the region, family offices, would be the most likely candidates to start allocating to Bitcoin, at least getting off zero. They're still kind of in the middle because of the complexity, the custody, the lack of understanding. But I think if the US government does go through with the Bitcoin reserve, that's going to add even more legitimacy than the ETFs. And a lot of people are going to be more comfortable allocating into their portfolios. So I think it's a huge market with tons of capital. And I think it has one of the biggest flows of millionaires, billionaires moving into the region, especially into the UAE due to the tax incentives, etc. It's a place where you get to keep your Bitcoin. Like the wealth you make from your Bitcoin is not taxed. There's no capital gain tax. So it's actually where you keep more of your Bitcoin. So yeah.
Amazing, man. Super exciting to see how that's going to unfold. I think we will see some stuff happening this year. I cannot imagine why not, specifically or especially when America would adopt a reserve like that. So as I've said many times before on the podcast, like I think it's just super entertaining. It's just so fun to follow. It's so fun to see, you know, this game theory unfold. And yeah, man, I wanna thank you for your insights. And I also wanna finish off with the last question, and that's I ask everyone the same question at the end.
Okay.
Which is, what is a core belief that you will never let go?
A core belief that I will never let go. Wow, man, I wish you told me about this earlier so I can put some
That's
thought.
why it's the last question.
I mean, I think you mean it's personal, right? Anything that that sticks with me. Man, I used to be a boxer and I actually won the Lebanese boxing championship. And I used to, it might be cliche, but you know, I tell myself, pain is the best educator. I mean, that's just how I live my life by. I mean, you grind, you work hard. When it's uncomfortable, it means you're growing. And that's my core belief, is that just keep grinding.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for sharing. Thanks so much for your insights. And I will see you in Dubai, I think.
Oh, man, waiting for it. Anytime, Bram. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Cheers, brother. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you can click here to find more just like it, and click here to find all Bitcoin for Millennials podcast episodes. Also, please like this video if you want to help shine a light on the message of Bitcoin, and subscribe to my channel to stay connected. I hope to see you for a next episode. Bye.